Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this new webinar in our Fleet Week Connected and Electric. I hope that you already enjoyed our previous sessions. And of course, we will continue our Fleet new exciting webinar that we have lined up for you. In this webinar, supported by Leaseplan, you will learn why and how fleet electrification is an effective and necessary way to tackle not only climate change, but also achieve CSR targets and eventually save costs. Indeed, Leaseplan's annual car cost index, now in its 6th edition, is a comprehensive analysis that reveals the total cost of ownership of a car, including fuel or better energy, depreciation, taxes, insurance and maintenance in no less than 22 European countries. And this car cost index also shows that the commercial case for switching your fleet to an electric fleet has never been stronger. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's webinar, I have the pleasure to introduce to you Sjoerd Brenters. He is the Director International Consultancy Services at Leaseplan, and his colleague at Leaseplan, Joël Wetterhahn, Fleet Consultant. And they will take you on a deep dive in the results of this report. Now, afterwards, ladies and gentlemen, you can ask your questions in a dynamic Q&A. And if you would like already to submit your question during the presentation of the people of Leaseplan, you can. You can do that quite easily by submitting your question via the chat in the tool. And at the end of the webinar, I will moderate the Q&A together with our expert speakers, Sjoerd Brenters and Joël Wetterhahn. Gentlemen, I hope that you are ready for an exciting webinar. I'm curious to see what you have in petto for us. So please take the floor.
Welcome to Fleet. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Fleet Week 2021. My name is Sjoerd Brenters. I'm joined here today by Joël Wetterhahn. We are both from Leaseplan, obviously. Today, we would like to talk to you about the Car Cost Index 2021. This is a study that we do on an annual basis, and actually we are at the 6th edition this year. Car Cost Index has developed over time into a broader and broader analysis. So we're very keen today to talk to you about some of the results and also do a little bit more of a deep dive. Like I said, I'm joined by Joël Wetterhahn. He is the person that worked on the content of the Car Cost Index, and therefore I'm very happy that I can go through this with him and also ask him some questions about the details of the study. So without further ado, let's get into it. Like I said, the 6th edition, the Car Cost Index has expanded over time. We started approximately 5 or 6 years ago with a smaller analysis of the Volkswagen Golf specifically in a number of countries. And from that starting point, we've expanded it into more segments, more countries, and it's become a very comprehensive study over time. We've now reached 22 European countries, like I said, with different segments, vehicle segments included in the study. So maybe Joël, can you elaborate a little bit on the details of the study?
Yeah, for sure, Sjoerd. First of all, indeed, it's called the Car Cost Index. Maybe sounds familiar. It's been actually, the idea is a little bit stolen of the whole idea of the Big Mac index. So what do you do? Per country, you try to find one, let's say, common denominator, and to try to find and compare the cost with that. Years ago, indeed, as Sjoerd mentioned, that was the Volkswagen Golf. Was a very suitable vehicle then, but it's been getting broader and broader. So now we actually include multiple segments, so multiple vehicle sizes and prices, which we then compare. Now, how do we get these numbers? We reach out centrally. We compile a list of vehicles of all different segments. In total, that is more than 100 vehicles. And we go to each of our local Leaseplan offices and we reach out to them and we ask them, hey, can we get a pricing for each of these 100 specific vehicles on a 48-month contract and 30,000 kilometers per year. We ask him not to include any local OEM discounts to make the comparison as fair as possible. So in total, if you do the math, 22 countries times more than 100 quotes per country, we received more than way over 2,000 quotes, which we then combine in this analysis, which is actually the fundament of the car cost index.
Great, thanks, Joel. So does that also mean, is it fair to say that when we are comparing an EV to an ICE vehicle, that we can fairly compare the fuel cost to the electricity cost?
Definitely, yeah. Good point. No, so per segment, what we did indeed, let's take an example of a segment, the D2 segment. We try to reach out to the countries and ask pricing for similar vehicles of different fuel types. So the BMW 3 Series is one of the vehicles that is considered a D2 segment vehicle. We ask pricing for the BMW 3 Series diesel, petrol, PHEV, which is also included this year. And then as an equivalent, for example, we also ask pricing for the Tesla Model 3, which obviously is electric. Now, in those segments, there's multiple vehicles included. Maybe we'll touch upon it in a little bit further, but that is the basis of how we compare per segment different fuel types to each other.
That's clear. Let's dive into some of the results that you can find on this slide. This is the summary, obviously. So the first thing you'll notice is that the price obviously varies across different countries, from 743 euros in Greece to 1138 euros in Switzerland. We'll zoom into the details in a minute a little bit more, but that is the first key takeaway there. Also, relative to the gross domestic product, total cost of ownership differs per country, obviously. It makes sense, but maybe Joel, on that point, could you zoom in a little bit on the details maybe of two of those countries?
Definitely. Why is this relevant? Well, first, we obviously have to incorporate the GDP per capita, the gross domestic product. Why? Because let's say 600 euros in Switzerland can buy you something else than 600 euros in Poland. And I take these two examples because I have figures of what the GDP is for those countries. Because in Switzerland, the GDP per capita is 71,000 euros last year, 2020. And for Poland, that is 34,000 euros. So you can obviously imagine that it's not about the absolute numbers. What is the price of driving a vehicle in euros? But if you compare that to the GDP, that gives it more context.
Yeah, very good. And obviously, we had to rely on the GDP numbers from last year, and the cost of driving a car are relating to this year, obviously.
Yeah.
But GDP for 2021 obviously still not in there. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Also, again, I think referring to the Big Mac index, where you can tell by the price of a Big Mac how what the relative price level is of a country. Moving on, Poland is the cheapest place to drive a petrol car, and Greece is the cheapest place to drive a diesel car. And on the right side of this slide, you'll find that electric cars in the premium midsize D2, that is Model 3 Tesla, BMW 3 Series, Mercedes C-Class, etc., are cost competitive in 17 European countries. For the C1 segment, it's true for 14 countries. And again, we'll have some more details on that in a minute. Finally, there's one model that we zoomed into in the next couple of slides is the Volkswagen ID.3, which we compare to the Volkswagen Golf. There's also a Golf EV, but we believe that the ID.3 is a very good, follow-up vehicle compared to the Golf EV, and we see that it's cost competitive in 12 countries already. So moving on, when we look at the final numbers, that's the total average. We're actually looking, as you can see on the right side, we're looking to various car segments and fuel types. So maybe, Joel, it's good that we give some background on the vehicle segments and fuel types included in these numbers.
Yeah, I can imagine, because we're looking here, this is one figure per country, but that is obviously if you combine everything, and what is actually involved in this number, and what does this mean? Well, first of all, it's important to understand and to realize that we're looking at TCO. TCO obviously stands for the total cost of ownership, and what is then included? That is a depreciation, which is a very big chunk, but also taxes, insurance, RMT, and fuel cost, or for the electric vehicles, the power cost. So that is actually the factors that are included in that number. Now, what else? What are we looking at? As we've mentioned earlier, these are the combination of small to big segments. From small is actually the B1. Vehicles in the B1 segment, think of an Opel Corsa or a Volkswagen Polo, all the way up to we go from C to D1 and then to D2, and you can also the SUV D2s, and you have to think of, for example, Mercedes-Benz GLC class. So the variety, the range, which is included in this graph, it's quite vast, and also this includes all fuel types from petrol, diesel, PHEV, and EVs.
Great. So it's clear that we're looking at small to large vehicle segments, and we included all the fuel types basically in the average numbers that you see here. Like mentioned before, we have some more details, so let's go into that. Let's start with the D1 segment. So maybe Joel, first you want to give some background on the vehicles that are included in the D1 segment. Obviously, if you see the subtitle here, electric is more affordable than petrol and diesel in the D1 segment in the majority of the research countries. So that means for 16 of the 22 countries, the comparison is positive for electric vehicles. But again, Joel, maybe you want to give some feedback on the models that we're looking at here.
Definitely, I can understand, because D1 doesn't really make a lot of sense maybe to a lot of people. The vehicles included, what are we actually looking at? Well, from the diesel and the petrol vehicles, we're looking at, for example, the Volkswagen Tiguan, the Opel Grandland, and the Ford Kuga. Also from a PHEV perspective, the Grandland and the Kuga are in there. And from a electric perspective, you have to think of the Volkswagen ID4 and the Skoda Enyaq, both from the Volkswagen Audi group, very popular vehicles at the moment, but also the iWays U5.
iWays U5, okay, that's interesting, and I think that's one of the new models, not yet out in many countries. What I understood is that they've only started in 2017 and making good progress. Maybe we can dive into that in a little more detail. We obviously checked with the 22 countries to see if the iWays was available for pricing. What is the result of that?
Yeah, that was a good point. It's actually, as you mentioned, 2017, only 4 years ago, including also, of course, the last years where everything has been maybe a little bit more challenging for startups. But so, as you said, we've reached out to 22 countries, 4 of them, which are the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and France, have been able to give us a quote, a price already. Whereas it's compared to the Volkswagen ID4 and the Skoda Enyaq, it's only in Germany where it's actually competitive in all the countries, but in Germany the iWays U5 is actually very competitive.
Yeah, I have the results here as well. So if we look indeed Belgium, Germany, France, and the Netherlands, for Belgium and Germany it was close, but in the more 10% range. Compared to the Volkswagen ID4. If we look at France and the Netherlands, the iWays U5 was actually quite comparable to the Volkswagen ID4 in terms of TCO. I think it's really interesting. In previous webinars, we've also talked about the upcoming brands from China. Of course, that won't happen overnight, but I think this is an interesting insight that we were able to get pricing for 4 countries so far. And also in terms of pricing, at least, they're quite comparable to, for example, Volkswagen ID4. So that's an interesting insight. Thanks for that. Moving on to the mid-size premium segment. As mentioned before, this is Tesla Model 3 versus some of its similar segment, like the Mercedes C-Class, the BMW 3 Series, and the Audi A4. I think what we're seeing here in this segment is it's already competitive in 17 out of the 22 countries, so it's thereby also the segment with the most countries where it is cost competitive. I would say based on previous years, this is also the trend. Meaning this segment is a very competitive segment for EVs. Maybe Joel, again a question: the models included in this analysis?
Yeah, as you've mentioned, the most popular model in this one, the Tesla Model 3, which is also included, for example, is the Polestar 2, which has definitely grown in popularity over the last year. And from the ICE perspective, the Audi A4 is included, the BMW 3 Series, the Mercedes C-Class. So let's say the usual suspects. Yeah. And indeed, 17 out of the 22 countries, this is the segment where the EV is most competitive, as we can conclude.
Great. All right. Let's move on. We're going to actually skip over the C1 and SUV C1 segment for now. We'll move straight ahead to the B1 segment. So that is clearly the smaller segments, and we thought it would also be interesting to highlight this. As you can see, electric vehicles are cost competitive in 8 out of the 22 studied countries. Again, Joel, same question. Can we get some feedback on the models included?
The models in the B1 segment for the ICE vehicles, we're looking at the Volkswagen Polo, Renault Clio, the Opel Corsa, and the Ford Fiesta. And then as from the EV side, we're looking at the Opel e-Corsa, the Renault Zoe, which has actually just been, let's say, facelifted and also been upgraded, and the Peugeot E208, which was the car of the year. You can see indeed that in this segment, well, still in 8, we're making progress, as the title suggests. In 8 out of the 22 countries, it's getting more, well, it is already competitive to drive. But you have to understand, this is also the TCO, so the total cost of ownership. Depreciation is a big chunk of that cost, and let's say the reason of why we're still making progress, but it's not competitive in all the countries yet, is that the difference between let's say the investment value in this segment, because the investment value in general is much lower, the difference between an ICE vehicle and an EV vehicle in this segment is much larger, and that is why in the, let's say, the little bit bigger and more premium segments, that difference is slower and the competitiveness is reached earlier.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So maybe for now, let's indeed move to the slide where we see the breakdown basically of TCO. And to your point, Joel, it's not always easy to interpret all the numbers and the share, but I think the point is indeed with the smaller vehicle segments, or I should rather say, let's start with the electric vehicles, which are still generally more expensive in terms of the purchase price, mainly due to the higher price of the batteries involved. That higher price for larger vehicles is often a little bit more offset by a similar share in, I should say a higher share in the cost for petrol. For smaller segment vehicles, if you think of, for example, the e-Corsa versus a regular Corsa, the higher investment value for that vehicle is usually not offset because the other components of TCO, like, for example, fuel versus energy, are relatively smaller in that segment. So again, the higher cost investment of the investment value is not offset by the other items. So that makes it still a little bit more challenging for the smaller vehicles to be cost competitive in that segment. I did skip a couple slides, so let's go back to this to summarize. We walked through a couple of the vehicle segments. I guess to summarize, what we are seeing is that in the subcompact segment B1, we still have some ways to go, but still already in 8 of the 22 countries, electric vehicles are cost competitive. We didn't zoom in on the C1 and SUV C1 segment. These are also the, I would say, usual suspects of Volkswagen Golf, Opel Astra, etc., compared to the, for example, Volkswagen ID.3. Cost competitive in 14 out of the 22 countries. For the D1 segment, it's looking really good and green, as you can see on this slide. 16 out of 22 countries, and for the D2 segments, 17 out of 22 countries. So that's really looking good. We did also zoom in on one particular model in this example, Volkswagen Golf versus ID3. I think I said at the beginning, there is also a Volkswagen Golf EV, but I do believe that the Volkswagen ID3 will be the follow-up, very comparable vehicle to the Volkswagen Golf. It's cost competitive, the ID3, in 12 out of the 22 countries. So that's, I think, a very interesting development. Joel, any other models that we could elaborate on for now?
I think that there's indeed so let's say the Opel Corsa and the e-Corsa that we've seen that the difference is still in the small segment. That's maybe the difference is large, and the higher you go, let's say in segment, but also in purchase price, the competitiveness seems to be more available. So, for example, in the SUV C2 segment, we have the Volvo XC40. That model has been out for a couple of years yet already, but since last year there's also an fully electric version of this, and we see that in I think that in half of the, so let's say in 10 of the 22 countries, also that the Volvo XC40 is the electric version is the most competitive one. So indeed, you see that for the same, let's say, vehicles, there's also the availability is getting up. So more electric models are becoming available, which is obviously a good thing, and it's becoming more competitive.
Yeah, I can imagine it's hard to see without the actual numbers, but it really depends, and I think that's also a good way to kind of wrap it up. It really depends still on the country and the vehicle segment to see where the switch to EV makes sense. But the conclusion definitely is, also compared to previous years, that EVs are becoming more and more competitive in more and more countries as well. So yeah, with that, I would like to close this off. Thanks for your attention.
Good. So thank you, Joel, and thank you, Sjoerd. Thank you for your presentation. I already noticed that there are questions in the chat, so I invite the both of you to come into the tool again, and that we can have an animated Q&A based on the questions that popped in. Some interesting information, of course, that triggers some question. Let me start. There is a question from Johan Suffert, or it's a question or a remark. He mentioned you did not include expected or guaranteed residual value in your TCO calculation. Is that correct? And if so, why?
No, the short answer is residual value is of course included in the study. It's not a guaranteed RV. Yeah? That's almost never the case with RV, but TCO in this case, the depreciation specifically, is also based on the expected residual value of the vehicle after 4 years and 30,000 kilometers per year.
Okay. There are, of course, some questions around charging. Where did you consider the charging costs, and did you also consider the difference, for example, between office charging, home charging, public charging in your calculation? Because the price, of course, can fluctuate quite a bit.
Let me take the first bit, and then I'll hand over to you, Joel, because indeed you have some details on the charging, the share of charging. But on the first bit, the actual charging station is not included. There's a couple of reasons. There's different pricing for charging stations, but especially the installation of charging station varies a lot depending on the particular situation of the driver. And additionally, what we're seeing is that there's more and more availability of charging stations, public charging stations, or people that have already installed a charging station. So That bit is not included in the analysis. On the actual charging cost, Joel, you can have some feedback, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very good question, because indeed it really depends where you charge, so of course in which country, but also the location. So what we did is we divided into 3, let's say, locations. It's either at home, it's at the office, or it's public charging, so on the street. We've assumed the charging behavior for this analysis to keep it constant, to keep the comparison, let's say, fair, that you charge 60% at home, 30% at the office, and 10% on the street, so public. And for all of these, let's say, charging stations, there is unique electricity costs in euros per kilowatt hour being used for the calculation. And those electricity costs are from last July, and from the source is Eurostat, so the European statistical system. So yeah, that's how we calculated the electricity costs.
Okay. A question from Zolt Bankel. How much this lower TCO that you now have calculated in many countries, how much is this due to the state of the financial incentives and the support that governments or cities are giving?
Yeah, the actual impact is hard to assess, but it is true that, of course, EVs benefit from tax incentives. That is totally true. I do also think that over time that benefit will become a little bit less. If you look at the Netherlands, there's benefits for EVs. The taxation on the car is lower, the benefit in kind is lower. But I think as time progresses, that will gradually move towards, the normal situation, if I can call it like that, as we see it now for ICE vehicles. So there's definitely a benefit there. But obviously, there's a reason for that as well, because as we also mentioned in the webinar, the catalog price for vehicles, for EVs, is simply higher. So it requires a little push here and there to offset that higher investment.
Okay. Coming back to Joel, related to your answer regarding charging, there is a follow-up question. You mentioned that you took in 10% for public charging. Does this mean that this is then fast charging?
That is indeed the cost for fast charging, yeah.
Okay. Another practical question about the parameters of your study. Did you also take into account elements like temperature? Because we know that EVs in the winter and in the summer, that can also have an impact, of course.
Yeah, I also saw a question on if we took into account green electricity, but I think it's good to emphasize that this study is really about comparing the TCO. I guess the question comes from the fact when it's colder, you would need more electricity basically for the same range. But to be honest, we didn't go that scientific route this time. No.
Okay, so that is perhaps something for the future. Really good. Then, of course, you know it as well. Many fleets do not only have passenger cars, but also light commercial vehicles. Is there something to say about your look at LCVs, ELCVs? Will that come in the future if it's not already done?
Maybe Joel, you want to say something based on a study we did before for another client?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I would like to say that indeed we did actually reach out when we reached out for the car cost index, got some pricing for LCVs as well. For all, we divided in 3 segments: the small, the medium, and the large. We got prices for diesel, petrol, and electric equivalent vehicles. So hold on tight. Somewhere in the next, let's say, months, we'll release a similar study on that as well, with some early conclusions. Give away a little bit of the conclusions. You could say that in the LCV large segment, so in the larger LCVs, you see that things as the range is still really limited, and especially if you increase, so the larger the vehicle gets, the more volume you can put in the vehicle, and the mass will increase, and you see that really has a massive impact on the range as well. So for I would say that maybe the larger the LCV segment goes for now, you could say that at this moment, EVs are really challenging. Really depends on the business. Is it only the last mile delivery? There's definitely opportunities, but the longer the distances get, the more challenging it gets. In the smaller LCV segments, there's more models available. And it seems to be that for that segment, there's really some business cases to be developed that it really is interesting. So hold on tight. Some further conclusions will come in let's say the next month.
Okay. Continuing, people are really interested in your findings. Ron Sullivan asks, is there a minimum number of kilometers for the findings of your car cost index to remain true? And the TCO is calculated on a 30 kilometers a year. Does it change dramatically, for example, if it's 20,000 kilometers a year or 40,000 kilometers a year? Have you looked at that already?
Not in this study, obviously, but it is a total fair point. However many miles you drive, the investment value of the vehicle obviously doesn't change. So if you would do only 10,000 kilometers per year, the higher investment will lead to a relatively higher TCO per month. So that makes sense. I think, and this is roughly speaking, that if you do 20,000, 25,000 kilometers per year, it could already be interesting to switch to EV. If you do less, I can imagine, like if you really, maybe a private person, you're driving 10,000, 15,000 kilometers per year, and especially in the smaller segment, we also touched upon that Opel Corsa example. If you drive 15,000 kilometers per year privately in an Opel Corsa, let's say roughly speaking, speaking for the Netherlands, I think the price for the electric Corsa is almost twice as much as the or at least 1/3 more. So that's a big investment to make for lower mileage. So indeed, with that lower mileage, it becomes less interesting. But again, I think around 25,000 kilometers, you could fairly say that it might be interesting to switch to EV.
Okay. Continuing on that, you have now done this study for the 6th time. Probably you also have seen an evolution in those 6 years. We still see, roughly speaking, that some countries in Central Eastern Europe are perhaps lacking behind a bit in EV readiness. Do you expect them in the upcoming years also to become as EV ready as the other European countries? And if so, what is a little bit the time frame that you see that, let's say, the whole of Europe becomes EV ready?
There's the crystal ball question, which we get quite often. Unfortunately, we can't exactly look into the future. And I know this is not always a satisfying answer, but it depends on so many factors, like how is price going to change for the vehicles itself? What is going to happen with residual value? Is, for example, diesel or petrol going to be taxed more? The fuel itself, for example. What's happening with the charging infrastructure? That's a very fair point, and also one of the limiting factors for Eastern Europe, I would say, in many cases. So yeah, again, we don't have a crystal ball, but if we look at the development over the past couple of years, we started with comparing a Volkswagen Golf a couple of years ago, and we've progressively developed that into comparing more and more vehicles, models, but also including EV. We do see, and my point there is we can't exactly compare 5 years ago to this because the basket of vehicles changes. We've expanded the analysis, but there is definitely a trend. That's why I think the maps that we've showed are kind of nice with orange versus green. The green is getting more common over the years. And I think that's why I pointed out in the presentation also the Model 3 in the D2 segment. That is really a popular segment. And we do see that that specifically in that segment, EV is getting more and more competitive. And we do feel, I think we mentioned that, this is not very scientific, but we do think that within the next couple of years, so imagine the next 5 years approximately, we would also see more green for the Eastern European countries.
Okay, good. Of course, we are now living in a situation where energy prices are increasing. Do you forecast any car prices of cars decrease in the future, rise in the future, and with the energy prices going through the roof, will that not change the TCO configuration in such a way that perhaps EV readiness becomes less interesting, or the opposite perhaps?
That is also a very fair point. Again, this is looking into the future, right? And we know just as much as you about the future. And two things what I'd like to highlight is that in the TCO breakdown that we've seen for petrol, electric, PHEV, and diesel, you see that for the electric vehicles, the fuel cost in percentages is around 10%. So an increase of electricity cost of 10-20% would result in a 1 or 2% increase over the total TCO. So the impact won't when the energy prices double, the TCO of an entire electric vehicle won't double, obviously. Similar what we've seen for the petrol and the diesel prices over the last couple of months, they've been going through the roof as well. And then lastly, if you have the opportunity to have, for example, some solar panels on your own home, that is something that you can control yourself, right? Your own energy generation. Whereas for diesel and petrol, you're always reliant on external suppliers and the pricing for that. So it's something that we cannot really afford pricing in that, but you have to realize that the impact on the total TCO is limited for EVs as well.
Okay. Leaseplan is, of course, a big advocate of fleet electrification. You also have a lot of experience. Do you consider any difference in the accident rate between EVs and conventional vehicles? And related to that, what about the repair costs? Are they the same for EVs and ICE vehicles?
Yeah, I'm going to be very honest. I don't know the exact details there. We're not so much involved with damages and accident rates. The part where I think that on the price part of the question, yes, I think it's generally more expensive because of the potential battery impact and the precautions to be taken when repairing a car. I think that's true for EVs. If the accident rate is higher, I would have to look into that with colleagues from our insurance and from insurance department, because I'm sure they have some details on that. Based on what I see in general, what we're all seeing, if you look at Tesla, for example, with a lot of cameras and systems preventing accidents, I would imagine that going forward, the accident rate for EVs would go down.
Okay. Another question related to the fact that if corporate fleets would like to go EV, and based on your presentation, they can go EV in quite some countries in Europe, but do you have any tips to mention in terms of the first vehicles to replace? Where should corporate fleets look at? Are these the oldest vehicles? Are these the ones with a certain daily mileage? Are these the ones with the highest fuel consumption? Are there any tips that you can give to fleet managers if they are going electric, with what vehicles first to start, or what drivers first to start?
Yeah, I would like to, maybe Joel in a minute has more detail, but what I would like to point out is one thing that we support our clients with is the fleet opportunity scan. And what we do there actually is identify which vehicle segments and which countries make most sense to switch to EV first. And what we do there, but again, Joel is more of the expert on the content there, but at least what we'll do is we will take a client's fleet and segment that, so put the vehicles into different segments. And what you can imagine, I'll take a simple example because we already used the example of large vans. If you have large vans that are currently diesel and that drive 40,000, 50,000 kilometers per year, it's going to be a difficult segment to switch to EV first, right? Because of the charging challenges, the range, the price is still really, really high. That's a difficult segment to switch first. On the other side, if you would look at, let's take the Netherlands, and you have a lot of Volkswagen Golfs petrol at the moment that drive 30,000 kilometers per year, because we already touched upon that mileage question as well. Well, we will have a Volkswagen ID3 or a Nissan Leaf that could probably be a very good alternative for the Volkswagen Golf petrol. So yeah, sorry to say, it depends on country, on the vehicle segment, but we do have an approach there where we pinpoint where to start with, and it really makes sense, because it doesn't make sense to focus on the large LCV diesels that do a lot of mileage and get pricing. We can already tell you it's going to be hard to switch there first. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Joel, you would like to add something, or?
I think Sjoerd just summarized almost the entire fleet opportunity scan. And what I do like to add is that it really also depends on your ambition, right? So if your ambition is I want to really decrease my CO2 footprint, then we will have a look at your fleet and see where is the highest impact over, if you're internationally, if you're locally, per segment. And that has to do with the bigger the vehicle you drive, obviously the more grams of CO2 you emit per kilometer, but also if you drive a lot of kilometers, that will increase the total output of your CO2. So if your ambition is I want to go fully green and decrease my CO2 output, we will zoom in and focus on that. If you have, let's say, financial or commercial incentive, that's maybe another way to look at it. So from that perspective, we indeed look at the countries where it makes sense. What we use there, really, that's what I want to highlight as well, is a study that we release annually as well. I think in February of this year, you can find it online. If you Google for the EV readiness report from 2021, and it really takes a couple of factors into account on the country level. So EV models availability, pricing, but especially also charging infrastructure, which can really be a make or break for your decision. So everything combined, that's what we use to, let's say, advise you on exactly the question you have. If I want to start, where could I start, in which country, which segment, and what will my impact be over time?
Mm-hmm. Can we say that, based on the presentation that you have done and the Car Cost Index 2021, that countries are ready? Apparently, if you look at the strategy and the plans of corporate fleets, they also seem ready. They would like to go electric, or at least sustainability is the main pillar on their strategy agenda. But that governments are perhaps the weakest link and need to do more when it comes to securing a strategy in terms of financial support, charging infrastructure development, etc., so that for the real uptake of fleet electrification, that we are still dependent on the governments and the authorities. Is that true, or don't you see it that way?
I think a big part of that is definitely true. Our CEO also commented on the Car Cost Index on Dutch radio the other week. And he always also uses his own example. He lives in the center of Amsterdam, and he's really happy, of course, to switch to EV. You can imagine in Amsterdam, when you live close to the canals, there's a couple of charging stations. Most of them are often, if not all the time, taken, which basically prevents you from being able to charge your vehicle. And that is still a big limitation in terms of the charging infrastructure. And the Netherlands is an example where in general you have a lot of charging stations, but even there it could still be a challenge. The same is of course true for people living in apartment complexes where you couldn't charge, or you would really need more charging infrastructure there. So even when all the lights are green in terms of pricing and availability, that is still a limiting factor. I think also in terms of incentives on the vehicle itself, there's best practices from Norway, Finland, from the Nordics at least, where you can use the bus lane, where you can park for free, etc. And you really see that is a major incentive for people to switch to EV. So that can definitely help. So governments definitely have a big role to play, yes.
Mm-hmm. Is it now the time for every business, every company, in every industry to switch to electric in Europe?
Yeah, I would say it's not black or white. Of course, the car cost index also shows, of course, that we have different countries, country maturity. Still, like we said, depends on the vehicle segment as well. But you could also take a very practical approach. If you have a car policy with a budget of X amount of euros and you have a driver that is really willing to switch to EV, based on the current or the available budget, you could see if something fits within that budget, and if the Volkswagen ID3 actually fits within the budget, then the driver can quite easily determine for him or herself if the vehicle can be charged at home, excuse me, or could only charge it at work, and what needs to happen in the charging area. And in looking at it simply like that, the EV is becoming less and less of a rarity, if I can use that word. It's becoming more and more mainstream, and sometimes I feel, but maybe I'm talking too much from a Dutch perspective, that we're overcomplicating things. I totally understand the country differences, etc. But yeah, you can get started. Let's put it like that.
Okay. The final question. Leaseplan, we know, of course, as a global leasing and fleet management company. Where can you support corporate fleets that would like to go electric? Is it on the complete transformation? Is it the financing side? Can you give some brief details around where you can support them?
Yeah, so Leaseplan is a full service provider. That means that we support from the financing of the vehicle, the beginning of the chain to the end of the remarketing process. So we can support from beginning to end and everything in between. So that also relates to the maintenance and the potential damages and any other fine ticket processing, stuff like that. And let me stay close to my team, myself, Joel, and David, who's also in my team, as you know, Stephen. We can more practically support you with some of the things we mentioned already. Joel mentioned the EV readiness index that is available. You can find that online. And more specifically, we could zoom in on anyone's fleet with the fleet opportunity scan and really pinpoint the areas where you could best start.
Okay, but coming back to fleet electrification, via your company, I can also have an integrated approach where I have and the charging infrastructure and the vehicle, the services all around, etc. The complete package. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Gentlemen, I think that we can end the webinar. There are a few things that we need to mention. Your presentation has raised some questions. There are also questions in terms of can the presentation be shared? Now I leave to the gentlemen of Leaseplan, of course, but what I can say is that, and on Fleet Europe, but for sure on Leaseplan's website, you can find all the details of that car cost index 2021. And we will also in the chat put the link towards the place where you can find that car cost index. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think this was a great webinar. I would like to thank Sjoerd and Joel for the presentation and for your expertise, and of course also Leaseplan for supporting our Fleet Week. Our Fleet Week will continue tomorrow. Then you can relive all the sessions that we had since Monday. So if there is something that you missed that you would like to relive, you can do that via our website fleeteurope.com from tomorrow on. So definitely worthy to take a look also there. And then finally, I would like to thank all our sponsors that have supported us for this Fleet Week. And then don't forget that also during the Fleet Europe Summit on the 9th and 10th of November in Brussels, we will, of course, tackle the topics of connected and electric, because we have seen that both topics are high on the agenda of today's corporate vehicle fleet managers. Thank you very much for your attention. Once again, thank you to Leaseplan, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.